Sinister stories.
David had taken the nighttime security job at Eaton Tower to escape his financial troubles. The corporate building was sleek, modern, and utterly lifeless after hours. 12 floors of glossy floors, cold steel, and glass. A perfect stage for monotony. His shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. The job seemed easy enough. Walk the floors, check for unlocked doors or malfunctioning equipment, and sit in the security room watching the endless loops of surveillance footage. But from the first night, something about the building felt off. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was oppressive, like the building was holding its breath. The faint hum of fluorescent lights echoed through the empty hallways, broken occasionally by the distant whir of the elevator, though no one was there to press the button to summon it. By the third night, David started noticing things. He was patrolling the 6th floor, a level filled with conference rooms and open office spaces. His flashlight beam sliced through the darkness as he moved down the hallway, his footsteps echoing. Then he heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet across the carpet. David froze, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Building's closed. You're not supposed to be here." The sound stopped. David waited a moment, listening. His flashlight illuminated the empty corridor, but his unease grew. He radioed the front desk, just in case. "Control, this is David. I'm hearing movement on the 6th floor. Can you check the cameras?" The static-filled response crackled through. "Copy that. One moment." David continued down the hall, his grip tightening on the flashlight. He reached the end and turned the corner, but it was empty. "David, this is Control," the voice came back. "I'm not seeing anything on the 6th floor. Are you sure you heard something?" He hesitated before responding. "I'm sure. Maybe it was just the HVAC." But he didn't believe his own words. By the second week, the incidents became more frequent. David sat in the security office one night, sipping stale coffee and scanning the monitors. The grainy black and white footage flickered across 12 screens, each showing a different floor. At first, everything seemed normal. Empty desks, motionless hallways, and locked doors. But then, on the 10th floor feed, he saw movement. A figure in a dark suit walked past a row of cubicles. David squinted, leaning closer to the monitor. The person was tall, their movements deliberate. "Control, this is David. I've got someone on the 10th floor, moving to check it out." "Copy, David. Be careful." Grabbing his flashlight and radio, David took the elevator to the 10th floor. As the doors slid open, an icy draft hit him, raising the hairs on his arms. He stepped out, his flashlight cutting through the dimly lit floor. "Security, show yourself!" There was no response. He moved through the cubicles, his footsteps muffled by the carpet. The office was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint buzz of electricity. David reached the spot where he had seen the figure on the camera, but there was no one there. He turned in a slow circle, his flashlight sweeping the room. Then he felt it, a presence behind him. He spun around, the beam of light catching only empty space. "Control," he whispered into his radio. "I'm not seeing anything up here, but I swear I'm not alone." The voice on the other end hesitated. David, we're reviewing the footage. There's no one on the 10th floor." David stared at the camera mounted in the corner of the room. He knew what he'd seen. The encounters grew stranger. One night, as David patrolled the 11th floor, he heard laughter. Soft, muffled giggles echoed from the end of the hallway, near the executive offices. He moved toward the sound, his heart racing. "This isn't funny," he called out. The laughter stopped. David turned a corner and froze. A man stood at the end of the hall, his back turned. He was wearing an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in black and white photographs. "Sir, you're trespassing," David said, his voice firm despite the fear creeping into his chest. "Turn around, slowly." The man didn't move. David stepped closer, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "I said turn around." The man's head twisted, not his body, just his head, until it was facing David. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes sunken and black. David stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The beam spun across the floor, briefly illuminating the man's legs, which ended in nothingness. His lower half dissolved into shadows. When David scrambled to pick up the flashlight and looked again, the hallway was empty. David became paranoid. He spent more time in the security office, glued to the monitors. The figures he saw became more frequent, sometimes a woman in a long dress wandering the lobby, other times a child darting between cubicles. They always disappeared by the time he arrived to investigate. He started hearing whispers too, faint voices calling his name. One night, while reviewing footage from earlier in his shift, he noticed something chilling. On the 6th floor feed, as he walked the hall with his flashlight, the grainy image showed several figures standing behind him, their faces obscured. He hadn't seen or felt anything in the moment, but on the tape, they were there, following him silently. David didn't sleep that day. The final night of his shift, David decided to confront whatever was haunting Eaton Tower. He brought a portable recorder, hoping to capture evidence of the strange occurrences. As the night stretched on, he walked each floor, asking questions into the void. "Who are you?" he asked on the 7th floor, his voice echoing. "Why are you here?" he asked on the 10th. "Leave me alone," he whispered on the 11th. Nothing responded, but when he played back the recording in the security office, his blood ran cold. After each question, faint voices whispered in reply, "Help us. You don't belong here. He's coming." David stared at the recorder, his hands shaking. Then the lights in the security office flickered and went out. The monitors went black, but the screens then began to glow faintly, one by one. On each floor's feed, shadowy figures appeared, standing in clusters, staring directly at the cameras. David's radio crackled. A voice, low, guttural, and not human, came through. "Run!" The security office door slammed shut, and the temperature plummeted. David grabbed his flashlight and bolted for the exit. He burst into the lobby, the cold air biting at his skin. The front doors were locked, though he had unlocked them earlier. Behind him, footsteps echoed. Many footsteps, like a crowd marching in unison. David spun around, his flashlight illuminating the empty lobby. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. "Let me out!" he screamed, pounding on the glass doors. The lights flickered, and when they stabilized, the lobby was filled with figures. They stood motionless, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes fixed on David. At the center of the crowd was the man in the old-fashioned suit, his head tilted unnaturally. David backed against the door, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. "What do you want?" he shouted. The man smiled, his lips stretching impossibly wide. David rushed back to elevator and just pressed any button. The elevator appeared to be rising uncomfortably slow. Then David's radio went off, and the words spoken at the end horrified David to complete state of shock. The voice replied, "David, who are those people in the elevator with you?" David could not see anyone around. Then the elevator suddenly and the doors remained closed. The elevator screeched to a halt, shaking violently. David's flashlight flickered, casting jagged beams against the metal walls. He frantically jabbed the buttons, but nothing happened. The doors didn't budge. The radio crackled again, the distorted voice cutting through the static. "David, who's in there with you?" David whipped around, swinging the flashlight in all directions. The small elevator was empty, except for him. But then the air grew heavy, oppressive, and the temperature plummeted. A faint whisper brushed his ear, too close. "David!" He pressed himself into the corner, his breathing ragged. The light in the elevator dimmed until it was almost pitch black. His flashlight suddenly gave out, plunging him into complete darkness. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in tones he couldn't understand. They grew in number, rising to an eerie, ghostly chant. "Let me out!" David screamed, slamming his fists against the elevator doors. The chanting stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then the lights flickered back on, weak and sputtering. David turned and froze. The elevator was no longer empty. Figures surrounded him, their translucent forms pressing in from all sides. Their faces were pale and distorted, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The man in the old-fashioned suit stood at the center, his head tilted at that impossible angle. "David!" the man said, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated through the walls. "You shouldn't have stayed." David couldn't move, couldn't scream. His body felt paralyzed as the figures drew closer, their mouths opening in silent wails. The man's smile widened unnaturally, splitting his face as he raised a hand and pointed at David. The elevator plunged. David's stomach lurched as the car dropped, faster and faster, the walls rattling violently. The figures closed in, their ghostly hands reaching for him, their faces twisting into grotesque shapes. "No! No!" David shouted, thrashing wildly. The elevator stopped abruptly, slamming to a halt with a deafening crash. The lights went out again, and David was thrown to the floor. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't in the elevator anymore. He was standing in the lobby, though it wasn't the same. The air was thick with fog, and the once polished floors were cracked and covered in dust. The walls were charred, the glass doors shattered. The figures surrounded him again, silent and motionless, watching. At the center stood the man in the suit, now grotesque and decayed, his empty sockets burning with faint crimson light. "This is where you belong now," the man said, his voice reverberating like thunder. David stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The figures closed in, their hands gripping him, pulling him down. The floor beneath him cracked and gave way, revealing an endless void. He screamed as they dragged him into the darkness. The next morning, the building was quiet, its halls empty. A replacement guard arrived for his first shift, glancing at the eerily clean floors and the faint reflection of his own face in the glass doors. As he settled into the security office, the monitors flickered on. On one of the screens, a lone figure wandered the 10th floor, a man in a security uniform, his flashlight flickering weakly. The guard frowned and reached for the radio. "Control, I think someone's on the 10th floor."